Welcome. This is James Corbett of Global Research TV at GRTV.ca with this week's Global Research feature interview. Reminding the listeners and viewers once again that this video interview series is also available as an audio podcast, and the link to subscribe to that podcast will be available in the video description for this video. But this week we're excited to have on the line with us Tom Secker, the documentary filmmaker behind the highly popular 7/7 documentary, 7/7 Seeds of Destruction, and the newly released 7/7 documentary, 7/7 Crime and Prejudice, which is available on Global Research TV at GRTV.ca. So, Tom Secker, it's always great to talk with you. Thank you so much for coming on with us today.
Yeah, good to talk to you again, James. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, well, so am I. As I'm sure people who have seen some of your work before or seen interviews with you, you're quite a well-researched person, and you bring a lot of, I think, solid facts to a topic that sometimes does stray into rather speculative areas, and I think that's a breath of fresh air, and it's good to see such a well-documented piece of work coming out. So I'm quite excited about the documentary itself and talking about the different aspects that you raise in it. But to start out, I guess on something of a devil's advocate type footing or something like that, I'd like to start with this kind of justify your existence question. It seems 7/7 is a area that's been well explored by many different documentaries so far, and I guess just in the last couple of years since your first 7/7 documentary, Seeds of Deconstruction, came out, I guess the question is what really has changed, or what new information do you have to justify an entirely new feature-length documentary on the subject?
Well, I mean, the most of the new information came from the 7/7 inquests that took place from October last year to, they finished in May this year, I think the final conclusion was given. And I'd always intended, if the first film went down well, if it was well received, if people appreciated what it was that I was trying to accomplish with it, I'd always intended to do a follow-up film. Either a sort of remake or adjustment, re-edit of the original one. But, I mean, following the 7/7 inquests, and in particular following the July 7th Truth Campaign's inquests blog, I thought, there's abundant new questions that have been posed by this. There's a lot of new evidence. I mean, we probably have more evidence, new evidence now than we did in September of last year before the inquests started. There is thousands of pages of testimony. There are hundreds and hundreds of pages of exhibits, and I thought there's certainly enough in here for a new film. It's also that there were other aspects to the whole 7/7 issue that I didn't really cover in the first film. The first film looked at the history of black ops and looked at the Home Office narrative of what happened on 7/7, and basically asked the question, given all the problems with this narrative, is it possible that 7/7 was another one of these kinds of black ops? Whereas in this one, I focused slightly less on the Home Office narrative and slightly more on the police investigation, because that's, in many respects, even more important. There's a lot of talk in the 7/7 movement about the need for a public inquiry, and I certainly support an independent public inquiry. If we could ever get one, it would be a great thing to have. But there is another option here, and that is to try and get the police investigation reopened so that they could start looking at some of the fresh evidence. And again, not that likely to happen, but there are historical precedents. There are reasons to be optimistic that that could actually be a realistic goal. So I thought, in this follow-up film, I would look at some of the other things to do with, say, Northern Ireland and what have you, that also provide context to all of this, but also look specifically at the police investigation, the new evidence from the inquests, and see where I could come to with all of it, and see if, once again, I could try and raise some interest in this and try and get people thinking about it.
That's right, and the documentary does raise a lot of interesting questions that I haven't really delved deeply into before, so I was quite thankful for that. And I think just as in Seeds of Deconstruction, I think one of the interesting aspects that really caught my attention the first time I viewed that was the fact that even which trains and traveling in which directions had been affected by these blasts was not exactly nailed down even in the official version of events. I thought what was interesting in this... Well, I thought what was interesting in 7/7 Crime and Prejudice was that even the diagrams and schematics that eventually came out about what where the bombs took place in each train carriage and where people were standing. There's massive discrepancies between that and the various witnesses and things like that. Perhaps you can talk about some of those discrepancies, because it seems that, again, the 7/7 inquest actually raised more questions than it answered in many respects.
Oh, I mean, it certainly raised more questions than it answered. It didn't even answer the fundamental questions it was supposed to be answering, the questions it is obliged by law to be answering. I mean, that was supposed to be the whole purpose of holding the inquests, but they seem to have forgotten all about that almost from day one and just used it as a massive propaganda exercise. Particularly the issue of where the bombs were in the carriages. One of the reasons I focused on this, and one of the reasons why that's something that in the inquests I was particularly keen to see, was there has been this this theory, if you like, that the bombs weren't inside backpacks, they weren't carried onto the trains, they weren't left in bags on the trains or anything like that, but were somehow built into them, built into the floor or strapped underneath the trains or whatever. And now, we don't have any particularly solid physical evidence of this, but certainly the predominance of eyewitness statements are more consistent with that than with an explosion inside the train and bursting out. So when the Metropolitan Police entered a series of diagrams into the evidence at the inquests, and these detailed things like where each individual passenger was supposed to have been standing or sitting at the point of the explosion, where the bodies then ended up after the explosion, and how the recovery process came to find these people. That is what's supposed to be explained in these diagrams, but there's huge contradictions between those, the Metropolitan Police official story, if you like, and what the Home Office narrative says. Let's take Aldgate, the train going from Liverpool Street to Aldgate Station. There's a lot of other problems with that, but let's assume for the sake of argument there was one explosion on that train. It's supposed to have taken place by Shazad Tanweer using a backpack bomb sat down at the rear of the train. That's what the Home Office narrative says. Now, at the inquests, they did have a witness who called Michael Henning, who was in the next carriage along from where the explosion happened, and he said he saw a man sitting in roughly the seat where the Home Office narrative says Tanweer was. But the problem is his description doesn't fit Tanweer. He admits he couldn't identify the man positively, he just was sort of aware of someone being in that location. And the other major problem is that according to the Metropolitan Police, the explosion didn't take place as you would expect in the sort of floor in front of that seat, but in fact around the corner in the standing area. And that's where all of the people who died were apparently also standing. So you have a distance of only several feet, maybe, but nonetheless, it's a big enough difference that you have to wonder, why is it that the Home Office narrative has Tanweer placed in a seat where he clearly couldn't have been sitting if he set off that bomb? There is also the issue that the man who was actually sat in that seat, who Michael Henning apparently saw, was a guy called William Walsh. And William Walsh suffered relatively minor injuries in this explosion, even though he was supposed to only be a few feet away from it. You also have another witness from the next carriage along, a woman called Elizabeth Kenworthy, whose interviews and statements I've featured in both of my films, because I consider her a reliable witness. I mean, she was an off-duty police officer. She is someone who is trained in retention of information. She is trained in observation. You would think her statement of all of these people's would probably be among the more accurate. Now, her testimony and her diagrams that she drew of what she found when she entered this carriage after the explosion shows, large damage to the floor in front of that seat where William Walsh was, but also large damage around the corner in the standing area where Tanweer supposedly was. And, furthermore, it shows another hole on the other side of the carriage, further up the carriage, some, I don't know, maybe 25 feet away, 20 feet away, something like that. So it's very difficult to see how one single explosion of a small device in a backpack put on the floor could cause a crater in the floor there, sort of rip the floor up several feet away and blast another hole in the other side of the carriage 20 feet away. I mean, the implication of this is presumably that there were more devices, or that the devices hit those trains in some other way. And of course that would mean that those four men weren't responsible, because they didn't, if those weren't backpack explosions, then those guys didn't cause it by carrying backpacks onto them. And you get the same kind of issue on the Piccadilly line explosion between King's Cross and Russell Square. They say that the explosion took place in the standing area. That's what the narrative says. And fair enough, the police diagram does show an explosion in the standing area. But one of the main problems is a man, I think he was the duty station manager at Russell Square, who entered the train sometime after the explosion. He draws another crater several feet away between rows of seats, and also where they found Jermaine Lindsay's ID, his letters and driving license and whatever, and also where they apparently found his body, is some, I don't know, 15, 20 feet away. There's an entire row of seats in between the standing area where the explosion is supposed to have happened and where they found the effects and his body, and from that they draw the conclusion that he caused the explosion. Now, of course...
And am I to understand correctly, because it sounded like from the narration in your documentary that the Jermaine Lindsay's personal effects were somehow separate from his body, because you posit that he sort of deposited the things on the ground and moved over and planted the backpack and then ended up on the floor next to his personal items. So were they physically removed from his pockets?
Well, what they were suggesting, they had an explosives expert, a man called Dr. Clifford Todd, who has appeared in many various instances of this story about 7/7. They had him testifying at the inquests, and he's from, I think he's from Porton Down. He's, government explosives expert, basically. And he described how the items that they found, the identifying items for Lindsay, showed no sign of explosion damage, and so he postulated that they had been deliberately separated, that i.e. they had sort of got onto the trains, scattered the items on the floor, and then wandered off some distance before setting off the bomb, which doesn't make a huge amount of sense for various reasons. I mean, for one thing, these men are supposed to be Islamic suicide bombers. They are supposed to not be caring about their identity in this world because they are embracing the afterlife, and they're becoming martyrs to whatever cause it is they're supposed to have believed in. So why would they be so desperate to make sure that they were identified quickly after the bombs have gone off? And in particular, on the Piccadilly line one, you would have Jermaine Lindsay having to muscle his way past 20 or 30 people who are standing or sitting in the areas where he must have moved through for this story to have made sense, and none of them remember seeing him. Now, is it really plausible, stood on a crowded tube train, that someone's going to push their way past you, having just chucked their wallet and whatever on the floor, pushed their way past you, shoved their way into the middle of the carriage, gone down onto the floor, taken their rucksack off, blown themselves up, and no one sees any of this? No one remembers any of this. It doesn't add up. It simply doesn't add up. And it's the same kind of thing with the Edgware Road bombing, but even more so, because there, it seems that this explosion or explosions, whatever happened there, didn't just blow one hole in the floor of the carriage, but blew as many as 5, 6, maybe 7 holes in the floor of this carriage. And we're talking almost from one end of the carriage to the other. They were so spread out. And again, I cannot for the life of me see how one explosion in a rucksack is going to destroy almost the entire floor of a tube carriage. It doesn't make sense. So again, the implication is those explosions were caused by some other means than a rucksack-bearing suicide bomber.